My son's own flight attendant slipped me a napkin. Pretend you're sick. Get off this plane. I smiled politely, thinking she was overreacting, maybe even joking. But when she came back, pale, shaking, and whispered again, "Please. I'm begging you." I ignored her. I thought I was being reasonable. 2 hours later, I realized my mistake almost cost not just my life, but my son's too. Before I tell you what happened next, please like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, because one small warning, if ignored, can change everything. You need to understand who I was before that day, before everything changed. My name is Margaret, and for 37 years, I stood in front of classrooms filled with restless children, teaching them about fractions and multiplication tables and the importance of listening to adults. I was the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, who bought school supplies with my own money, who believed that structure and reason could solve any problem. I was proud of that reputation. I was proud of my life. But my greatest pride, my deepest joy, was my son Daniel. From the moment he could walk, that boy had his eyes on the sky. While other children played with toy cars, Daniel built paper airplanes with the precision of an engineer. He'd stand in our backyard for hours, adjusting wing angles, testing different designs, his little face screwed up in concentration that reminded me so much of his father. When he was 7, he announced that he was going to be a pilot. Not a fireman, not a superhero, a pilot. And unlike most childhood dreams that fade with age, Daniel's only grew stronger. I watched him work for it. Through high school, when his friends were out partying, Daniel was studying aerodynamics. Through college, when money was tight and I worked double shifts at summer school just to help with tuition, he never complained. He knew what he wanted, and he was willing to sacrifice for it. Flight school was brutal. The hours, the pressure, the constant testing. But Daniel pushed through every obstacle with a determination that both amazed and worried me. The worry was always there, lurking beneath my pride. Every mother of a pilot knows it, that cold fear that settles in your stomach when you think about your child 30,000 feet in the air, responsible for hundreds of lives, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But I learned to push that fear down, to focus on the joy instead. Because when Daniel called me 3 months ago to tell me he'd finally earned his captain's wings, the happiness in his voice made every sleepless night of worry worth it. "Mom," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion, "I did it. I'm a captain now. All those years of dreaming, all those years of your support, it finally happened." I cried that night, alone in my kitchen, overwhelmed by a mother's pride so pure and powerful it felt like it might burst my heart wide open. That's why when Daniel's airline offered me a complimentary flight, a gesture of appreciation for families of their pilots, I jumped at the chance. It felt like the universe giving me a mother's reward, a moment of peace after years of sacrifice and worry. I would fly as a passenger on his airline for the first time, surprise him after landing, maybe even tour the cockpit where my little boy now commanded the skies. He used to hold my hand crossing the street. Now he commands the skies. The thought filled me with such overwhelming emotion I had to sit down. This was my chance to see his world, to understand the environment where my son had found his calling. I booked the flight immediately, choosing a seat in coach despite Daniel's suggestion that I use his employee benefits for first class. I wanted the full passenger experience. I wanted to see what his passengers saw, feel what they felt, understand completely the trust they placed in my son's capable hands. The morning of the flight, I dressed carefully, my best navy suit, the pearl earrings Daniel had given me for my last birthday, my hair done at the salon the day before. I wanted to look like the proud mother I was, professional and elegant. I arrived at the airport 2 hours early, checked my bag with unnecessary care, and found myself sitting at the gate an hour before boarding, watching the planes taxi past the windows and thinking about my little boy who used to watch them with such wonder from our backyard. But from the moment I stepped onto that plane, something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just an unsettling sense that the atmosphere was too controlled, too carefully orchestrated. The flight attendants moved with mechanical precision, their smiles too practiced, their greetings too rehearsed. It was like watching actors perform a play they'd done 1,000 times, hitting every mark but somehow missing the soul of their performance. The attendant who caught my attention first was young, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a perfect bun and makeup applied with military precision. She moved through the cabin checking seat assignments with an intensity that seemed excessive for a routine domestic flight. But it wasn't just her efficiency that unsettled me, it was the way her eyes lingered on each passenger's face, as though she was memorizing features, cataloging details, looking for something specific. As I settled into my window seat, I watched her work. She'd glance at a passenger, check her clipboard, then look at them again with an expression I couldn't quite read. When she reached the man in the navy blazer 3 rows ahead of me, she paused longer than usual. He was unremarkable, middle-aged, thin, wearing expensive-looking clothes and reading a financial magazine with the kind of intense focus that suggested he was absorbing every word. But something about their brief eye contact made my stomach tighten. The teenager sitting near the emergency exit was another source of unease. He couldn't have been more than 19, with shaggy brown hair and nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting. His backpack sat on his lap instead of in the overhead bin, and he kept checking the zippers, running his fingers along the seams like he was making sure everything was secure. Every few minutes, he'd whisper something under his breath, prayers, maybe, or some kind of mantra. The intensity of his focus was unsettling. Then there was the woman in business attire sitting across the aisle from me. She looked like any other frequent flyer, laptop bag, tailored suit, the kind of professional polish that comes from years of corporate travel. But her hands shook slightly as she scrolled through her phone, and she kept glancing toward the cockpit door with an expression that could only be described as fearful anticipation. I told myself I was being paranoid. After 37 years of teaching, I'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was wrong in a room full of people. Classroom management requires constant vigilance, an awareness of mood and energy that becomes second nature after decades of practice. But this wasn't a classroom full of restless 7-year-olds. This was a commercial flight, and these were adults going about their normal business. Still, the feeling persisted. The cabin felt charged with nervous energy, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Conversations were too quiet, laughter too forced, movements too careful. It was as though everyone was playing a role, following a script that hadn't been shared with me. The boarding process took longer than usual. The attendants checked and double-checked passenger manifests, had quiet conferences near the galley, and made several trips to the cockpit that seemed unnecessary for a routine flight. I found myself straining to hear their whispered conversations, catching fragments that meant nothing individually but somehow felt significant in combination. Confirmation received, I heard one attendant say into her radio. Package secured, proceeding as planned. Package? What kind of package required that level of security discussion? I tried to dismiss it as routine airline terminology, but the tension in her voice suggested otherwise. As we prepared for takeoff, the unease in my stomach grew stronger. I'd flown dozens of times over the years, family vacations, teacher conferences, visits to see my sister in Portland. And I'd never felt anything like this. It wasn't fear of flying, it was something else entirely. It was the feeling you get when you walk into a room and realize everyone was talking about you just moments before, that sense of being on the outside of something significant and potentially dangerous. The engines roared to life, and I pressed my face to the window, watching the ground crew make their final preparations. Somewhere in the cockpit above me, my son was going through his pre-flight checklist, probably humming the way he always did when he was concentrating. The thought should have comforted me, but instead it intensified my anxiety. What if something happened to this plane? What if my decision to surprise him put us both in danger somehow? I was so lost in these worried thoughts that I almost didn't notice when the young attendant approached my row. She moved casually, as though she was simply checking on passengers before takeoff, but when she reached my seat, she paused. Without making eye contact, she placed a cocktail napkin on my tray table. At first, I thought it was just standard service preparation. But then I saw the writing, black ink, hurried handwriting that looked like it had been scrawled in desperation. Pretend you're sick. Get off this plane. I stared at the napkin, reading the words over and over, certain I was misunderstanding something. This had to be a mistake. Maybe the napkin was meant for someone else, or maybe it was some kind of training exercise I didn't understand. I looked up, searching for the attendant who had left it, and found her standing near the galley, her back to me, her shoulders rigid with tension. What kind of joke is this? I thought, my teacher's instincts immediately suspicious of what seemed like inappropriate behavior. But even as I tried to rationalize it away, something in my gut told me this wasn't a joke. The handwriting was too urgent, too desperate. The attendant's body language was too tense. Whatever this was, it was real. I folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into my purse, my hands trembling slightly. Around me, other passengers were settling in for takeoff, adjusting their seats, closing their eyes, or pulling out books and magazines. The normal, everyday activities of air travel continued, but I felt separated from it all by an invisible barrier of growing dread. Minutes passed. The plane continued its pre-flight preparations, but the attendant didn't return. I kept glancing toward the galley, hoping to catch her eye, to somehow signal that I'd received her message and needed clarification. But she seemed to be avoiding my section of the cabin entirely, focusing her attention on passengers toward the front of the plane. Then, just as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom to announce our departure, she appeared again. This time, she approached directly, her face pale and her hands visibly shaking. She leaned down as though adjusting my seatbelt and whispered, so quietly I had to strain to hear her, "Please. I'm begging you." The desperation in her voice hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a joke, wasn't a mistake, wasn't some bizarre airline protocol I didn't understand. This was a young woman, terrified and desperate, risking her job and possibly her safety to warn me about something. The professionalism she'd maintained throughout boarding had cracked completely, revealing raw fear underneath. I wanted to respond, to ask her what was wrong, to demand an explanation. But before I could say anything, she'd moved on, continuing down the aisle as though nothing had happened. I sat frozen in my seat, my heart pounding so hard I was sure other passengers could hear it. The logical part of my mind, the part that had spent decades solving problems and managing crises in classrooms full of unpredictable children, tried to take control. Maybe she had mistaken me for someone else. Maybe there was a medical emergency brewing and she thought I was a doctor. Maybe this was some kind of security drill that passengers weren't supposed to know about. But the instinctual part of my mind, the part that had kept me safe through 37 years of teaching in increasingly challenging schools, was screaming warnings. That young woman was genuinely terrified. Her fear was real, immediate, and directed specifically at my safety. Whatever was happening on this plane, it was serious enough to make a professional flight attendant risk everything to warn a passenger. The engines grew louder, and I felt the familiar sensation of the plane beginning to taxi toward the runway. Through my window, I could see the terminal growing smaller, the ground crew waving their final farewells. In a few minutes, we'd be airborne, committed to whatever destination awaited us. The finality of that realization sent a fresh wave of panic through my chest. My mind raced through possibilities, each more frightening than the last. Was there something wrong with the plane? Had they discovered a mechanical problem that hadn't been announced? Was there a security threat? The way the attendant had looked at other passengers, studying their faces with such intensity, suddenly took on sinister significance. I thought about the man in the navy blazer, the way he'd avoided eye contact with the attendants while somehow managing to keep his attention focused on the cockpit door. I thought about the teenager with his carefully guarded backpack, his nervous whispering, his position near the emergency exit. I thought about the businesswoman and her shaking hands, her fearful glances toward the front of the plane. What if they were all connected somehow? What if the attendant had recognized something, some pattern or threat that I was too naive to see? My years of teaching had made me good at reading group dynamics, at sensing when students were planning something disruptive or dangerous. But this was different. These weren't children acting out, these were adults, and the stakes were infinitely higher. The plane turned onto the runway, and I felt the engines building power for takeoff. This was it, my last chance to act on the attendant's warning. But act how? I couldn't just stand up and demand to get off the plane without causing a scene that might make things worse. If there really was some kind of security threat, drawing attention to myself could put everyone in greater danger. But what if the attendant was right? What if staying on this plane meant I'd never see Daniel again, never get the chance to tell him how proud I was of everything he'd accomplished? The thought of him learning about my death through official channels, of him blaming himself for my decision to fly on his airline, was unbearable. I closed my eyes and tried to calm my racing heart, to think clearly about my options. I could press the call button and complain of sudden illness, nausea, chest pains, something that would require medical attention and delay takeoff. It would be embarrassing, potentially humiliating, but it would get me off the plane. Or I could trust my rational mind, ignore the warning, and hope that whatever the attendant feared was either imaginary or manageable. But as I sat there trying to decide, I kept hearing her voice. Please. I'm begging you. The raw terror in those words was impossible to dismiss. This wasn't a woman prone to hysteria or paranoia. This was a professional doing her job who had seen something that scared her badly enough to risk everything to warn a stranger. The plane reached the head of the runway and paused, engines roaring at full power. In 30 seconds, we'd be airborne and committed to whatever awaited us at 30,000 feet. The window for action was closing rapidly. My hand moved toward the call button, then stopped. What if I was overreacting? What if this was all some misunderstanding that would result in nothing more than embarrassment and delay? I'd spent my entire career teaching children to think before acting, to consider consequences, to use logic instead of emotion when making important decisions. But I'd also spent 37 years learning to trust my instincts about people, to recognize when someone was genuinely in distress. And everything about that young attendant's behavior screamed genuine distress. The plane began to move, accelerating down the runway. The point of no return was seconds away. I had to decide now, trust my logical mind or trust my instincts. Trust my training as an educator or trust my intuition as a mother. I pressed the call button. The attendant, not the one who had warned me, but an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, appeared almost immediately. Yes, ma'am. How can I help you? I'm feeling dizzy, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite my racing heart. Nauseated. I think I might be sick. Her expression shifted immediately to professional concern. Oh dear. When did this start? Just now. Suddenly. I feel like I might faint. The lie came easily, supported by the very real physical symptoms of fear that were coursing through my body. She signaled to another attendant, and within moments they were helping me unbuckle my seatbelt. Through the activity, I caught sight of the young woman who had warned me. She was standing near the galley, watching our interaction with an expression of barely concealed relief. Captain, the older attendant spoke into her radio, we have a passenger medical situation. Requesting return to gate. The engines immediately began to throttle down. I felt the plane slowing, turning, beginning the process of returning to the terminal. Around me, other passengers murmured in confusion and irritation. A businessman complained loudly about delays. A mother tried to explain to her crying child why we weren't taking off as planned. but all I could focus on was the young attendant's face. As our eyes met across the cabin, she mouthed two words that made my blood run cold. "Thank you." The return to the gate took 15 minutes that felt like hours. I sat in my seat, supported by the older attendant who had brought me water and was monitoring my condition with professional care. But my attention was entirely focused on the other passengers, on the subtle changes in behavior that were becoming increasingly apparent now that I was looking for them. The man in the navy blazer had gone completely rigid when the captain announced our return to the gate. His magazine lay forgotten in his lap as he stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles standing out. The teenager near the emergency exit had pulled his backpack even closer to his chest and was whispering more urgently now, his words too quiet to make out but his agitation impossible to miss. Most telling was the businesswoman across the aisle. When the announcement came that we were returning to the gate due to a medical emergency, she'd closed her eyes and let out a breath that could only be described as profound relief. Her hands had stopped shaking, her rigid posture had relaxed, and for the first time since I'd been watching her, she looked genuinely calm. As we pulled up to the gate, the young attendant who had warned me moved closer to my section of the cabin. She was still maintaining her professional demeanor, but I could see her positioning herself strategically, keeping an eye on specific passengers while staying close to me. "Ma'am," she said quietly as the jetway connected to the plane, "let's get you some fresh air. Sometimes that helps with nausea." She helped me gather my things, her movements efficient but unhurried. As we walked toward the exit, she whispered, almost inaudibly, "Your seat wasn't yours. It was switched this morning." The words hit me like ice water. Switched? By whom? Why? What did that mean for whoever was supposed to be sitting there? My legs felt weak, and it wasn't entirely an act anymore. We reached the jetway, and I turned back to look at the plane one last time. Through the windows, I could see passengers settling back into their seats, preparing for what they assumed would be a brief delay before takeoff. The man in the navy blazer was checking his watch repeatedly. The teenager was still clutching his backpack. The businesswoman was back to scrolling through her phone, but her earlier relief had been replaced by renewed tension. "Ma'am," the attendant said urgently, "we need to keep moving." We walked quickly through the jetway and into the terminal. As soon as we were clear of the gate area, she guided me to a quiet corner near an unused boarding gate. Only then did she allow her professional mask to drop completely. "My name is Sarah," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not just a flight attendant. I'm working with federal authorities, and what you just did may have saved your life." Federal authorities? The words didn't make sense. I stared at her, waiting for an explanation that would help this nightmare start to make logical sense. "There's a situation," she continued, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "We've been tracking a threat for weeks. The seat you were assigned this morning, someone changed it from the original booking. You weren't supposed to be on that plane." "I don't understand," I whispered. "Who is supposed to be there? What kind of threat?" Before she could answer, her radio crackled to life. "All units, we have movement. Suspects are active. Initiate Protocol 7. Sarah's face went white. "Oh God. They're not waiting for takeoff." Through the terminal windows, I could see our plane still sitting at the gate. But something was happening. Security vehicles were approaching rapidly, their lights flashing. Airport police were running across the tarmac. And from the plane itself, I could hear shouting. "Ma'am, I need you to stay here," Sarah said, already moving away from me. "Don't go near that gate. Don't try to go back to the plane. Promise me." But I couldn't promise anything. Because through those terminal windows, I could see chaos erupting on the plane I'd just left. Passengers were standing, some trying to reach the exits, others pressed against the windows. Security personnel were boarding through multiple entry points. And somewhere in the cockpit of that plane was my son. The next few minutes passed in a blur of sirens, shouting, and controlled chaos. Airport security surrounded the gate area, keeping curious travelers at a safe distance while uniformed officers boarded the plane. I stood frozen in my corner spot, watching events unfold with the surreal detachment that comes with extreme shock. Through the windows, I could see passengers being evacuated through the jetway in small groups, each one questioned briefly by security before being directed to a separate waiting area. The process was methodical, professional, but the tension was palpable even from my distant vantage point. Then I saw him, the man in the navy blazer, being escorted off the plane in handcuffs. He wasn't struggling, wasn't shouting, but his face was twisted with rage and what looked like bitter disappointment. Behind him came the teenager, also in custody, his precious backpack now in the hands of what appeared to be a bomb disposal specialist. My legs gave out completely, and I had to grab onto a nearby chair to keep from collapsing. Bomb disposal. The teenager's backpack. My seat that had been switched. The pieces were coming together in a picture so terrifying I could barely process it. Mrs. Morrison? I turned to find a man in a dark suit approaching me, his badge clearly visible. FBI, according to the identification he showed me. My name is Agent Patterson. I understand you were a passenger on Flight 447. My son, I managed to whisper. Is my son okay? He's the captain. Captain Morrison is fine, ma'am. He's being debriefed now, but he's completely safe. Thanks to your actions and Agent Reeves' quick thinking, we were able to neutralize the threat before anyone was hurt. Agent Reeves. The young flight attendant who had risked everything to warn me. I don't understand any of this, I said, my voice stronger now that I knew Daniel was safe. What threat? Why was my seat changed? What was supposed to happen? Agent Patterson guided me to a quiet seating area away from the crowds of curious onlookers and delayed passengers. Mrs. Morrison, for the past 6 weeks, we've been tracking a domestic terrorism cell planning to target commercial aviation. They had inside information about passenger manifests and were planning to use an explosive device during flight. The words washed over me like cold water. Domestic terrorism. Explosive device. During flight. The seat you were originally assigned belonged to a federal witness who was supposed to testify next week in a major organized crime trial. Someone within the airline's computer system changed the seat assignment this morning, putting you in her place. We believe the plan was to eliminate the witness and make it look like a random terrorist attack on civilians. I thought about the teenager's backpack, the way he'd guarded it so carefully, positioned himself near the emergency exit. The bomb was meant for her seat? The device was designed to detonate mid-flight, making investigation difficult and ensuring no survivors. By changing your seat assignment, they thought they were putting an innocent passenger in the target location while moving their actual target to safety. They didn't count on Agent Reeves recognizing that something was wrong. How did she know? Agent Reeves has been working undercover for 3 months, building a profile of suspicious activity on flights involving potential targets. When she saw the last-minute seat change and recognized that you didn't match the profile of the expected passenger, she realized something was wrong. Her decision to warn you forced the suspects to move before they were ready, which allowed us to apprehend them before the device could be activated. The full weight of what had almost happened hit me like a physical blow. If I hadn't listened to Sarah's warning, if I dismissed her desperation as overreaction or mistake, I would have died in an explosion 30,000 feet above the ground. And so would everyone else on that plane, including my son. The witness, I asked, where is she now? Safe. In protective custody. The threat against her was real, but thanks to what happened today, we've disrupted the entire network that was planning to eliminate her. Your quick thinking and Agent Reeves' courage may have saved dozens of lives. But I didn't feel heroic. I felt sick, overwhelmed, and desperately grateful. Grateful that I'd listened to my instincts. Grateful that Sarah had been brave enough to warn me. Grateful that Daniel was safe and would never have to live with the guilt of losing his mother on one of his flights. Mrs. Morrison? I looked up to see Daniel running toward me, still in his captain's uniform, his face pale with worry and relief. He reached me in 3 quick strides and pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe. "Mom, when they told me what happened, when they said you were on my flight and there was a bomb." His voice broke, and I felt his shoulders shaking. "I'm okay," I whispered into his shoulder. "We're both okay." He pulled back to look at me, his hands on my shoulders, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "If you hadn't gotten off that plane, if something had happened to you because of my job." "Stop," I said firmly, using my teacher voice. "None of this was your fault. None of it. You couldn't have known." But even as I comforted him, I was thinking about the chain of events that had led us to this moment. My decision to surprise him by flying on his airline. The sea change that had put me in danger. Sarah's decision to trust her instincts and warn me. My choice to listen to those warnings despite every logical reason to dismiss them. How many small decisions, how many moments of intuition and courage had combined to save us? How many other passengers had gone home to their families tonight because a young federal agent had been brave enough to risk her cover to warn a stranger? Captain Morrison? We both turned to see Agent Patterson approaching with Sarah, Agent Reeves, beside him. She looked exhausted but relieved, her professional composure finally relaxed now that the immediate danger had passed. "I wanted to thank both of you," Agent Patterson continued. "Your mother's quick response to Agent Reeves' warning prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. And Captain, your crew's professional handling of the emergency return allowed us to apprehend the suspects before they could adapt their plan." Daniel looked between Sarah and me, clearly still processing everything that had happened. "You saved her life," he said to Sarah. "You saved my mother's life." Sarah smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Actually, she saved her own life. I just provided the information. She made the choice to act on it. But I knew better. Without her warning, without her willingness to risk everything to protect a stranger, I would never have had the chance to make any choice at all. My teacher's training might have helped me recognize that she was genuinely afraid, but it was her courage that gave me something to recognize. "What happens now?" I asked Agent Patterson. "The investigation will continue, but the immediate threat has been neutralized. The device has been safely removed and is being analyzed. The suspects are in custody, and we've identified several other members of their network who will be arrested within the next few hours." He paused, glancing at Daniel and then back to me. "I should tell you that this case will likely remain classified for some time. The details of how we identified and stopped this threat could compromise ongoing operations if they became public knowledge." I understood. This story, this nightmare that had almost destroyed my family, would remain secret. There would be no news reports, no public recognition of Sarah's heroism or Daniel's professionalism under pressure. The 143 passengers who had been safely evacuated from that plane would never know how close they'd come to never seeing their families again. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said quietly, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. "When I gave you that warning, what made you decide to listen?" Most people would have dismissed it, thought I was crazy or mistaken. I thought about her question, about the moment when I'd had to choose between logic and instinct, between the safety of inaction and the risk of trusting a stranger's desperate warning. "I've spent 37 years teaching children," I finally said. "In all that time, I've learned that when someone is genuinely afraid, genuinely desperate, there's always a reason. You might not understand the reason immediately, but it's always there. And you were genuinely afraid." She nodded slowly. "My training taught me to recognize threats, but it didn't teach me how to convince a civilian to trust a stranger's warning. I was terrified that you wouldn't listen, that you'd think I was having some kind of breakdown. I almost didn't listen," I admitted. My logical mind was telling me it was probably nothing. But my intuition was screaming that you were trying to save my life. "Thank God you listened to your intuition," Daniel said, his arms still around my shoulders. As we talked, other passengers from the flight began filtering through the terminal, having been cleared by security and released to continue their journeys. Some looked shaken, others merely inconvenienced by the delay. A few recognized Daniel in his captain's uniform and approached to thank him for his handling of the emergency. Watching their faces, seeing their relief at being safely on the ground, I was struck by how close we'd all come to tragedy. These weren't just statistics or potential casualties. They were real people with families waiting for them, children who expected their parents to come home, spouses who had kissed them goodbye that morning expecting to see them again that evening. The businesswoman I'd noticed earlier walked past our group, pulling her carry-on bag and talking quietly on her phone. As she passed, she caught my eye and nodded slightly. In that brief moment of connection, I saw recognition in her expression. She knew, somehow, that my decision to leave the plane had been connected to everyone's safety. "Ma'am?" A young man approached us, airport security badge visible on his uniform. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some media trucks gathering outside. Word has gotten out that there was some kind of security incident. We'd recommend using the employee exit to avoid any unwanted attention." Agent Patterson nodded. "That's probably wise. The less public attention this receives, the better for ongoing security operations." As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, I found myself looking back toward the gate where our plane still sat surrounded by emergency vehicles. In a few hours, it would be cleared and returned to service. Other passengers would board. Other families would trust their lives to the skill of pilots like my son and the vigilance of crew members like Sarah. But for me, air travel would never be quite the same. Not because I was afraid to fly, but because I now understood how many unseen protections surround every flight, how many dedicated professionals work behind the scenes to ensure passenger safety, how many small acts of courage and intuition combine to keep us safe. "Mom," Daniel said as we walked toward the employee exit, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest." I looked at him, seeing the serious expression that meant he was about to say something important. "Are you okay with me being a pilot? After everything that happened today, after seeing how dangerous this world can be, are you okay with me continuing to do this job?" The question surprised me. In all the chaos and fear of the past few hours, it hadn't occurred to me to question his career choice. If anything, today had reinforced my pride in what he did for a living. "Daniel," I said, stopping to face him directly, "today I saw professionals handle an extraordinary situation with skill and courage. I saw flight attendants risk their safety to protect passengers. I saw a captain, my son, make decisions under pressure that helped save lives. Why would that make me want you to do anything else?" Relief flooded his face. "I was afraid that after today, after seeing how dangerous it can be." "Today I saw how important it is," I interrupted. "How much trust people place in pilots like you, and how seriously you take that responsibility. I'm more proud of you now than I was this morning, and I didn't think that was possible." We reached the employee exit, where a security guard was waiting to escort us to our cars. Outside, I could see the media trucks Agent Patterson had mentioned, their satellite antennas reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. "Will I see you again?" I asked Sarah as we prepared to part ways. "I hope so," she said. "Though probably not in professional circumstances." "Good," I said firmly. "I'd prefer our next meeting to be much more boring." She laughed, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked like the young woman she actually was instead of the federal agent she'd had to become. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Patterson said, handing me a business card, "if you need anything over the next few weeks, counseling, support, or if you remember any details that might be helpful to our investigation, please don't hesitate to call." I took the card, knowing I probably wouldn't need it, but grateful for the gesture. "Agent Patterson, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "The sea change that put me in danger, how sophisticated was it? I mean, could something like this happen again?" His expression grew serious. "The breach of airline computer systems is something we're taking very seriously. New security protocols are already being implemented. What happened today revealed vulnerabilities that we're working to address immediately. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was enough. I understood that there were aspects of this case that couldn't be shared with civilians, operational details that needed to remain classified for security reasons. As Daniel and I walked to our cars in the airport parking garage, the normal sounds of daily life, engines starting, car doors slamming, the distant rumble of planes taking off, seemed almost surreal after the intensity of the past few hours. "Mom," Daniel said as we reached my car, "will you do me a favor?" "Anything. Next time you want to surprise me, call first." I laughed, the first genuine laughter I'd felt since boarding that plane. "I promise. No more surprise visits to your workplace." "Actually," he said, his expression growing thoughtful, "I was thinking maybe you could visit the cockpit sometime when I'm not flying. See the controls, meet the crew during normal circumstances. You've earned the right to understand what I do without the drama." The idea appealed to me. After today, I wanted to understand his world better, to see the environment where my son exercised the skills and judgment that kept passengers safe. "I'd like that," I said. "Very much." As I drove home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I found myself thinking about the other passengers from that flight. They were probably home now, telling their families about the delayed flight and the mysterious medical emergency that had caused them to return to the gate. Most of them would never know how close they'd come to never making it home at all. The federal witness whose seat I'd inadvertently taken was somewhere in protective custody, probably still unaware of how the plot against her had been discovered and disrupted. Her testimony next week would proceed as planned, helping to convict criminals who had been willing to kill innocent people to silence her. And Sarah, Agent Reeves, was probably beginning the process of transitioning to a new assignment, her cover blown but her mission accomplished. Her willingness to risk everything to warn a stranger had prevented a tragedy that would have made international headlines and changed aviation security forever. But what struck me most was how ordinary it had all seemed until the moment of crisis. I'd been a retired teacher taking a flight to surprise her son. Sarah had appeared to be just another flight attendant doing her job. The terrorists had looked like normal passengers. A businessman, a college student, a frequent flyer. Evil and heroism had worn such mundane disguises that they'd been almost impossible to distinguish until the moment when choices revealed true character. When I reached my house, I sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside. The familiar sight of my front garden, the porch light Daniel had installed for me last Christmas, the neighborhood where I'd lived for 15 years, everything looked exactly the same, but I felt fundamentally changed by the day's events. I thought about the moment when I'd had to choose between trusting my logical mind or trusting Sarah's desperate warning. How many times in life do we face similar choices, smaller in scale, but similar in their requirement to act on incomplete information, to trust intuition over logic, to take risks for the sake of others? As a teacher, I'd made thousands of such decisions, trusting my instincts about which students needed extra help, recognizing when a child was in trouble at home, sensing when classroom dynamics were heading toward conflict. But today's choice had been different in its immediacy and consequences. Today, the wrong choice could have cost not just my life, but the lives of everyone on that plane. Inside my house, I made a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair, the one by the window where I'd spent countless evenings grading papers and worrying about my students. The routine felt comforting after the chaos of the day, but my mind kept returning to those moments of decision and the extraordinary chain of events that had saved us all. I thought about Sarah's question, what had made me decide to listen to her warning. The more I considered it, the more I realized that my years as a teacher had prepared me for that moment in ways I'd never anticipated. Not just the ability to read people and recognize genuine distress, but the willingness to act on incomplete information when someone's welfare was at stake. How many times had I intervened when I sensed a student was being bullied, even without concrete evidence? How many parent conferences had I initiated based on nothing more than intuition that a child needed help? How many classroom situations had I diffused by trusting my instincts about group dynamics and individual behavior? Teaching had taught me that sometimes the most important decisions can't wait for perfect information. Sometimes you have to act on instinct, trust your ability to read people and situations, and hope that your experience and judgment will guide you toward the right choice. But it had also taught me something else, that one person's willingness to speak up, to take a risk for the sake of others, can change everything. How many students had I helped over the years simply by being willing to have difficult conversations, to ask uncomfortable questions, to trust my instincts when something seemed wrong? And how many of those interventions had prevented crises I would never know about? Just as the passengers on today's flight would never fully understand how close they'd come to tragedy, I would never know which of my professional decisions had prevented academic failure, social isolation, or worse fates for the children in my care. The phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was my sister in Portland, calling for our weekly chat. "Margaret, you sound tired. Everything okay?" I almost laughed at the understatement. "It's been an eventful day, Linda. I'll tell you about it sometime, but not tonight. Tonight, I just want to hear about normal things. How are the grandkids?" As she told me about her grandson's soccer game and her granddaughter's school play, I felt myself grounding back into the everyday world of family relationships and ordinary concerns. But underneath the normalcy, I remained profoundly changed by the day's events. After we hung up, I called Daniel to check on him one more time. He sounded tired but good, processing the day's events with the same methodical approach he brought to flight planning and aircraft management. "Mom, I've been thinking about what Agent Patterson said, about how your quick response helped save lives. I know you're probably thinking of yourself as lucky, but I want you to know that what you did took real courage." I was terrified, I admitted. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Mom. It's acting despite fear. You were afraid, but you trusted your instincts and took action anyway. That's the definition of courage." His words meant more to me than any official recognition could have. This was my son, the little boy who had built paper airplanes in our backyard, now a commercial pilot with the wisdom to understand what courage really meant. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. I would wake up in my own bed, make coffee in my own kitchen, tend my garden and read my books and live the quiet life of a retired teacher. But I would do all of it with a deeper appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of ordinary days. I would also live with the knowledge that sometimes ordinary people are called upon to make extraordinary choices. That heroes can wear the uniforms of flight attendants and the faces of federal agents. That evil can disguise itself as respectability, and that safety often depends on the willingness of strangers to trust each other with their lives. Most importantly, I would remember that when someone reaches out in desperation, when someone risks everything to warn you of danger, the right response is to listen. Not with your logical mind, not with your skeptical adult reasoning, but with the part of yourself that recognizes genuine human need and responds to it with courage and trust. The last thing I thought about before falling asleep was Sarah's face when she'd whispered those desperate words. "Please, I'm begging you." In that moment, she hadn't been a federal agent or a flight attendant or anything other than one human being trying to save another. And my response hadn't been that of a retired teacher or a proud mother or any role I played in life. It had been the response of one human being recognizing another's genuine need and acting on it. That recognition, that willingness to trust and act on trust, had saved not just my life, but the lives of everyone on that plane. It was a reminder that the most important moments in life often come disguised as ordinary choices, and that the difference between tragedy and safety can be as simple as one person's willingness to listen when another person speaks from the heart. That day taught me something every parent should know, that love doesn't always protect you, but sometimes listening does. If someone ever warns you, even in whispers, don't brush it off. That voice might be the reason you live to tell your story. If this story moved you or made you rethink instinct, please like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Your comment might remind someone to listen, and that reminder could save a life.